The only way to really determine whether or not the deal is good or not is what happens next. The only good parts of the deal would be things that are not in the deal is the way that I'd put it. The deal itself is trash, but it also might be the best deal available. Both those things are not mutually exclusive. It turns out that freeing literally 1,000 terrorists in favor of a few Israeli hostages is by any stretch of the imagination an awful deal that will result in more dead Israelis. There's no question that not only will more Israelis be taken and kidnapped because of stuff like this, is true of Gilad Shalit as well. It means that many of these people who are currently being freed to Qatar and Turkey are going to make their way back into Judea, Samaria, Gaza, and they're going to kill Jews again, because that's always what happens. With that said, obviously it's a high priority to the Israelis to get their people back, and trying to bring back those people, even at that high cost, may be something worthwhile, since it's probably the last best opportunity. The thing that President Trump was willing to do that Joe Biden was not, was to basically say to the Israelis, this isn't the end of the war. You can go back in if you need to go back in, and to say to Hamas, it's not going to get better for you from here. It's only going to get worse for you from here if you turn down the deal. Neither of those things were things that Joe Biden was willing to say, which is why you end up with this deal. And again, so I think that all sides could have pushed harder to get more hostages out. I do. Do I think that Israel has finished the job in the Gaza Strip? I don't, nor do I think that Bibi thinks that, or that the Israeli government thinks that. And what comes next in Gaza, no one really knows the answer to that. And certainly leaving Egypt and Qatar in charge of Gaza would be a fool's errand and an idiotic idea. So yeah, I would be shocked if this deal reaches phase two. If it turns into a quote unquote permanent ceasefire without any real framework for operations on the ground, then obviously that would be a gigantic failure by the Israeli political establishment, because what the IDF actually performed in Gaza was a near miraculous feat of arms. To go into a heavily urban area, have essentially a terrorist to civilian kill ratio of 1-to-1 in that area. Well, yes, losing too many soldiers, but losing a bare fraction of the number of soldiers that Hamas lost, fighters and terrorist associates in this war. To then leave control of Hamas, of Gaza back to Hamas at the end of that would be a terrible loss. I don't think that that's Bibi's intent. I think Bibi knows that can't be his intent. The government will fall if that's Bibi's intent. And so, yeah, again, it's hard to assess the deal until you know what comes next. All I will say is I have yet to see a Middle Eastern quote unquote agreement that ever reaches phase two. There has never been a phase two in any of these agreements. Oslo never really reached phase two. A ceasefire agreement with Lebanon will not reach phase two. There's never a phase two. There's either phase two hasn't even been negotiated here. I mean, it's extraordinarily vague. So I think that everyone can hold all these conflicting emotions at once. Everybody's very happy to see the hostages home. We should be happy to see the hostages home. Everybody is devastated to see Israel give up control over militarily necessary areas like the Netzarim corridor. They should be very unhappy about that. Everybody should be very unhappy about watching murderers, actual abject child, women, entire families, murderers being released back to Qatar and Turkey. That is an act of tremendous horror. I mean, I know people who whose relatives were killed by people who are now being released, and every one of those lives is worth just as much as any other life. And so, I think that we can have all of these mixed feelings without suggesting, number one, that there was an easy solution, which I think there was too much demagoguing of this entire thing from the beginning. This idea that there was an easy solution, that if only Bibi had done X, Y, or Z, then the hostages would have come out sooner. Or if only Bibi had been more self-sacrificial. Or now, if Bibi were only harder. These are literally impossible decisions. And the minute that Israel decided to want its hostages back, there was always going to be a bad result at the end of a hostage deal, because any hostage deal is in and of itself a bad result. I have significant disagreements with the very basis of hostage deals in general. I think that the entire framework with which we think about this sort of stuff is deeply flawed. The minute you say to your enemy that if you take hostages, you have the ability to win the war on your terms, or even get your terms, all you're doing is leading to a massive incentive for terrorists to take hostages in the future. We all know this. We all know this. And eventually that math is going to have to stop. It will, because otherwise people will just keep getting kidnapped. And what price is going to be considered too much? As far as what the end of the war looks like, I mean, to me, it had always been the reality, but nobody was willing to say it out loud, that Israel was going to have to retain military control of the Gaza Strip. I mean, there was just no other alternative. Leave it. Who's going to do it? Egypt, Qatar, UAE, Saudi? None of them want. It seemed to me that always the most practical solution was going to end up being something like what Israel has in Jenin or Nablus, which is essentially security control of the area with transparency via units like Duvdevan, and allow them to go in and perform military activities in these particular areas, and some semblance of domestic rule for somebody to pick up the garbage. Like that'd be the best case scenario for the Gaza Strip. But, again, that would require a willingness to say the thing, which is that there are going to be Israeli soldiers in that area probably for the rest of time, and that there will be Israeli soldiers who die in that area for the rest of time, just like there are Israeli soldiers who unfortunately are killed in Nablus and Jenin every year. So, these are, again, there are no great answers here. As far as hitting the pause button, I think the logic is if you can get people out before you have to finish the job the way that I'm talking about, then get people out. And I think that that's probably the logic of the government here. What it looks like when they unhit the pause button, there may never be a quote unquote formal unhitting of the pause button. It might not be that the Israeli government says, okay, now the deal's over, we're going back in. It might just be these sort of soft operations without ever acknowledging that that's what's happening. I mean, that sort of stuff happens all the time in the Middle East. I mean, right now, Israel is supposed to be at the end of a ceasefire in Lebanon, and Israel has retained forces in Lebanon because Hezbollah keeps trying to interpolate its own forces into southern Lebanon. So, I think that what you'll end up with is sort of a grinding new status quo in the Gaza Strip is the most likely scenario. And as far as, the possibility of refugees in Gaza leaving the Gaza Strip, if they want to go, it's bizarrely non-humanitarian to tell people they have to stay in an area that literally has no livable running water or homes. And that's the fault of Hamas. But I mean, what exactly is the alternative? You leave 2 million people in an area that is going to be rubble for the next 20 years? The entire area is rubble. And by the way, it should be rubble because Hamas turned the entire place into a terrorist base. You turn terrorist bases into rubble. And so, if people want to leave and they want to go to Egypt or Qatar, I think it says a lot about Egypt and Qatar that they're perfectly willing to keep them in these supposedly inhumanitarian conditions rather than letting them into Egypt or Qatar or Jordan or anywhere else. We're not saying it, right? President Trump is saying this stuff out loud, and he should be saying this stuff out loud. I mean, the reality is, forget about taking refugees. Egypt has had the most solid border of Gaza is the border with Egypt. By far, it was much more solid than the border, as it turns out, that Israel had with the Gaza Strip prior to October 7th. Egypt's border had triple barbed wire fences and these massive impediments. And by the way, there's nothing on the other side of that border in Egypt. It's not as though there are gigantic settlements on the other side of that border. It's not like a Gaza envelope that's heavily lived in. There's not a bunch of Moshavim over there. There's nothing. It's a desert, and they still wouldn't let them in. And the reason they wouldn't let them in is because what everybody knows in the Middle East, but nobody's willing to say out loud, is that the Palestinian population is deeply radicalized, that they have heavy sympathy for terrorism, and everywhere a heavy Palestinian population goes, unfortunately, instability follows. And that's true from Jordan to Lebanon to what presumably would be Egypt. It was true in Kuwait. Kuwait expelled hundreds of thousands of Palestinians after the first Gulf War. And this is a major intractable problem. And again, acknowledging that would at least be an honest way of going about the issue.